Next on our list of super globals is session. So on the right hand side, let's click on a session. Session is again an associative array containing session variables available to the current script. See session functions documentation for more information on how this is used. So let's quickly open this one in a new tab. And just to let you know, sessions are similar to cookies in a way that they save the data into the file. But instead of saving the data on a visitor's computer, they save data on the hard drive on which the script is running, which is usually the web server, obviously. Let's quickly have a look at the session functions. We are going to discuss just a few of them. As you can see, there's a whole bunch that you can have a read about. And we are going to start with the session start function. It starts new or resumes existing session. It returns a boolean, basically true when the session has started successfully, false if for any reason it did not start. And then we have session start creates a session or resumes the current one based on a session identifier passed via get or post request or passed via cookie. And cookie is the most common approach. Then we have when session start is called, or when a session auto starts, PHP will call the open and read session safe handlers. This will either be a built-in safe handler provided by default or by PHP extensions such as SQLite database or Memcached, or can be custom handler as defined by the session set safe handler function. So you can basically define how you want to your sessions to be saved, and then obviously how you want to interact with them. The read callback will retrieve any existing session data stored in a specialized serialized format, and we'll have a look at this serialized format later on when we actually open the file to which cookie has been saved, and will be unserialized and used to automatically populate the session super global, basically adding this, converting this serialized format to the array. When the read callback returns the saved session data back to PHP session handling. So let's quickly open our editor. I've removed everything that we had in a previous video, and let's start with our session start. And now one very important thing about all these session functions, as you may remember with set cookie function, the same rule applies here. We cannot have any output to the browser before these functions. So if I place, let's say, just a space here, and if I open this file in the browser now, we're gonna get the warning, cannot send a session cookie, headers already sent by, and so on, as exactly the same thing as we had with set cookie basically. So remember, these functions cannot be cannot be basically placed within our code after the output to the browser has already been sent. So we have our session start. Now if we go back to our browser, I refresh now, and go to Firefox Preferences, then we go to remove individual cookies. And if I just chunk this window here and go to PHP course, see what's happened basically. This session start has created a cookie called PHP says ID. This is default name for the cookies basically set via this function. And as you can see, the content, the value which is associated with this session ID is this random number basically, and the alphanumerical basically string. Obviously it tells us what host it is obviously associated with the path to the cookie and so on. So let's quickly remove this one because I would like to set different name for our session basically. And this is also possible if we go back to our browser. If we have a look at the list of functions available here, we've got this session name. If I click on this one, you'll see that it gets or sets the current session name. This function returns the name of the current session. If name is given, as you can see, it's an optional argument here. Session name will update the session name and return the old session name. Then we have the session name is reset to the default value stored in session name at request startup time. Thus, if you need to call session name for every request and before session start. So if you use this session name, then on every page that you're actually going to be using cookies, you have to always use this function with this custom name, obviously if you define a custom name for the session, before the session start function. So let's give it a try, basically. If we go back to our editor, I'm just going to use session underscore name, and I'm going to call it, let's say, custom session name. And if we now save it, preview our page in the browser, refresh it, obviously on the page there's nothing to be displayed. So if we just go to the Firefox preferences, again remove individual cookies, and we go for our PHP course.dev, as you can see now the cookie name is custom session name. And it obviously the name again appears here, and then obviously we've got the ID of the cookie and all these other bits same way as before. Let's now remove this one as well. Now if we go back to our editor, another thing that we can do is to basically change the path to where the session actually is saved on our server. And when I say on the server, obviously at the moment we are working locally on our computer, so our computer acts as a server. Before we do this, however, I'm going to comment both of these lines, and what I want to do first is to use the function php info to find out where my sessions are saved on this computer. And if we go to our browser now, refresh the page, and there we go, there's a whole bunch of things passing. And what I'm interested in, I'm just going to use find here, and I just type session, and there we go, it takes me to the session section. And if you scroll down, you have a whole bunch of information about our sessions, basically, the handlers, name, the default name, as you may remember, that has been used when we use session start was PHP says ID, and all the other bits actually that you need to know, basically, about the session itself on your server. Now, the one we are interested in is the save path option. So session.save path. This is where our sessions are stored on this computer, on this server, say. So if we copy this, and I'm going to open Finder and go and use this Go option here on the Mac, then go to folder and paste this path into go to folder field. Now click on Go, and there we go, our Finder has been opened. You probably, when you're on the Windows or Linux, this folder is probably the hidden one, so you might gonna have to first make sure that your folders and files, invisible folders, hidden folders and files are visible before you'll be able to navigate directly to this folder. So basically this is where my sessions are saved. As you can see, session files are saved with this SESS underscore, and then you've got the session ID basically associated with this. So these are our sessions, just in case you obviously want to know where they are and what they look like. But what I want to do is to use a different path to the session. So let's say I want to store my sessions with my project. So if we go back to our editor, we can use, I'm just going to remove this PHP info and uncomment both of these functions. And if we open our browser and go back to our sessions section, we are interested in a session save path function. So if we click on this one now, you can see that this specific function gets or sets the current session save path, and then we have returns the path of the current directory used to save session data. It also takes one optional argument. When you actually pass the argument to this function, it sets the path. If you call this function without any argument, it will basically return the path to the path which is set basically for the sessions. So let's use this function. Go back to our editor and let's use session save path, and I want to use current directory, so I'm going to use the constant underscore underscore dir and then underscore underscore, then concatenate it with the directory separator, which is basically the / on Unix systems or / on Windows. And then we're going to use the folder name, let's call it sessions. and then semicolon obviously after this function. And now inside of our project, I'm going to create a new directory, call it sessions. And if we click on OK, now save this file obviously. If we go back to our browser, now if we load the page, obviously nothing's here because we are just working with the functions with session functions, but we're not outputting anything in the browser. If we go back to the editor, you can see now we have this new session inside of this directory. If I open this file, and I'm just going to open this as normal text file, there's nothing inside of this because we haven't actually created any sessions yet. We've created a file, but we haven't actually specified any session variables yet. So we've got custom name for the file, for the session, which created a cookie with this name. We've set up the custom path, the path to the directory where we want to save our sessions, and we started the session basically, which read this session file, and obviously at the moment there's nothing. So if we use our echo pre and then print r, and we use the session super global and then echo again and closing pre tag to format it nicely. If we go back to the browser, refresh it, we only get an empty array because obviously our session doesn't contain any variables inside of it yet. So the next thing would be to set the custom ID, because obviously as you can see the strings by default you probably would leave it, but I just want to show you how you actually can change this random number and create your own one. So if we go back to the php.net, to the section with the sessions, there is an option for session ID as well. So if we click on this one, and it gets or sets current session ID. Again, it takes one argument, which is optional. When it's without the arguments, it's going to return the session ID. When you provide in the ID, it's simply going to set it, and it says is used to get or set the session ID for the current session. The constant SID can also be used to retrieve the current name and session ID as a string suitable for adding to URLs. Again, URLs, problem with the URLs is that obviously they pose a bit of a security issue. Obviously they are not as safe as cookies because obviously your session is exposed in a URL. So I would strongly recommend against it, but it's entirely up to you if you want to play. Apart from with having sessions basically displayed in a URL rather than in a cookie, you also need to have your server set up in a certain way. So I'm not going to be covering this during this course, as it's not the most standard approach basically when it comes for the sessions. So let's go back to our editor. And what we're going to do is after session name, I'm just going to type session underscore ID, and I'm going to give it an ID of 1, 2, 3, for instance, and then semicolon. We have to always call all these functions before session start, because what happens basically, first of all, we need to tell it when we're going to be basically using this session start. When you're going to start a session, make sure that the directory is this directory basically when we're saving the cookie session, or when we actually fetching the session file from. Then the session name is this one, and then the session ID is this one. Okay, now that you know how we want this to be organized or which file we need to fetch, start it. That's how it basically works. I'll always make sure that these functions are called before the session start. So now that we have it done this way, if we go back to our editor, to our browser, refresh the page, our array is still empty, obviously, because we still haven't set any sessions. But if we go back to our editor, have a look at this. The new file has been created with ses underscore, and then we have the ID of our session. If we open it, it's still obviously an empty file, because, as I said, we haven't set any sessions yet. So it's probably a good time to actually add some sessions. So now that we have the environment ready, let's start with a session, and then let's give it a name. Let's say I don't know, school again. School equals, and it's going to be a string, obviously, SSD tutorials. If we now save it, preview everything in a browser, refresh the page, and there we go. Our array now has one item. Our session stores the school session variable with the value of SSD tutorials. Let's now open our editor and see what's inside of our session file, because now we've set a session variable. Let's see what we get inside. And there we go. We've got the index, which is school. S stands for a string. It has 13 characters, and then it's basically the value which is associated with this specific session variable. This is the serialized format that PHP uses for storing sessions. So now let's try another one. Say session name, and I'm going again to use my own name, Sebastian Sulinski. It's not that I love it that much, but it just comes naturally, as you might think about it. Okay, then we have session. Let's put some year value equals say 2015. We've got now, obviously it's an integer, so 2015. And then we got another session. Let's put, say, active, and I'm going to set it to boolean true. And then session, say, timestamp, and I'm going to set it to current time. Now if we save everything, preview it in a browser to trigger it, as you can see, everything has been added to the session. If we again open our file, there we go. You've got first one, the school, then we have name, which is a string as well of 18 characters with my name. Then we have year, which is an integer, so I 2015 value. Then we have active, which is a boolean, B letter, which is just basically one character, which true basically in this case because it's one, represented by number 1. Then we have timestamp, which is of an integer type as well, and it's just a timestamp in a Unix basically format. So that's our session saved. Now if we want to retrieve any information from the session, rather than obviously printing this as an array, if I just comment this one, we can do it exactly the same way as with all the other super globals we did before. So simply echo session, say school. And if we now save the file, go back to the browser, refresh it, and there we go. We simply output the value associated with this session variable. Then we can create another, we can change it basically to whichever other we want. Let's say year, save it, and preview in a browser. And as you can see, fetching data from session works exactly the same way as with any other super global we've been working with up to now. If we go back to our editor, now session ID, we simply typed in the value, and that's not quite the right way of doing this. The reason why is because if someone else is accessing the same system on their own computer, then they will create a new session with exactly same name, which means it will overwrite whatever your sessions basically created, which is obviously not ideal. So what we are going to do is remove this session ID and make sure that the system generates the default, basically randomly generated session ID. So what I'm going to do is to remove this session123 file. But what's going to happen in just a moment, you'll see that this file will be recreated. If I just go back, refresh the page, go back to our editor, and there we go, file has been recreated. And the reason why it's been recreated is because we haven't actually removed this session.